Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't we get started? My name is Jeff DeBelco. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're thrilled to have all of you here and, in fact, an online audience, including, I think, some of my students from the Monterey Institute out in California watching us online. So we're thrilled to have all of you here today to discuss issues of environment, conflict, and cooperation. This has been a program that particularly Alexander Karius and I have imagined for a number of years when he was first creating the exhibition that I hope some of you have seen downstairs. And we're very pleased to be able to have brought it to fruition with a number of partners that I'll tell you about. And it's been a terrific collaborative effort. And I should say the exhibition down on the ground floor is something that I hope you will get a chance to look at closely. I urge you to do it immediately after this meeting because there will also be the benefit of a reception and so some food and drinks, as well as some comments from my president here at the center, former Congressman Lee Hamilton, as well as the charge d'affaires from the German embassy, Johannes Haindl. And in fact, the German embassy is sponsoring this afternoon's reception, so we're very appreciative of that, and we hope that you will stay with us after we have our discussion up here today. A word about the Wilson Center where we're sitting in the Environmental Change and Security Program. The Wilson Center was created in 1968 by Congress to be the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson. He was our only president who had a PhD, and so Congress thought it would be good to bring the worlds of scholarship and policy together in a living memorial as opposed to building an obelisk on the mall or something that we go look at lunchtime. And so we do this in a nonpartisan, non-advocacy fashion, bringing these worlds together. The Environmental Change and Security Program is, I think, going on a 13-year-old program that tries to do this in issues of environment, population, development, health, and understanding how these global issues interact with foreign policy and security policy, issues of conflict and cooperation. And so obviously today's discussion is right at the core of what we've been trying to do in terms of bringing practitioners and scholars together on these issues for now 13 years. We have lots of partners in today's meeting, and I mentioned some of them. I'd like to thank particularly the German Embassy and the German Information Office. Mario Zus and Alexander Winter have been a joy to work with and really made this session possible, and as I said, the reception this evening possible, so it's been terrific working with them. Mark Berthold from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and we appreciate particularly their support, made Patricia's participation possible, and Mark's on his way back to Berlin for a position, and many of you know Mark has been very constructive in facilitating these discussions in Washington, so we'll miss having him here, but we'll be sure to stay in touch. Thanks to the intervention of the German Embassy, we also have DHL to thank for getting the exhibition here, which was not an easy task, I might say. Alex pointed out that it was perhaps a bit easier to get it to the, Tajikistan showing than it was to get it here. But we can talk about U.S. Customs later. And of course, Adelphi Research, the creator of the exhibition, and Alexander, the founder and co-director of it, have been longtime partners of us at the Wilson Center, well beyond this exhibition, but for, I'd say, probably a dozen years. Which gives me a chance to introduce our speakers for this afternoon, a panel that I'll make a few comments, but I'll tell you more about our more interesting panelists, my colleagues here. Alexander Karius, as I mentioned, is co-director of Adelphi Research, which is a research outfit based in Berlin, does a lot of work for the German government on these issues, a lot of work for the EU, OSCE, NATO, international organizations, really playing at multiple levels and supporting on the analytical side, but with very close interest and attention to the practical and the implementation and the policy. And so we're very pleased that he'll be here today to tell us about a lot of the activity that's going on in Europe. And there is a lot to talk about. So we're thrilled that he's going to share that with us today, and then, of course, has shared this exhibition with us downstairs. Patricia Cameron-Botte is another longtime friend of the Wilson Center and collaborator with the Environmental Change and Security Program. Patricia is a professor and faculty of law at University of Nairobi. She's also program director for the International Environmental Law Research Center, the Africa office. I think it's a UK-based organization. She's a former chair of the Kenyan Nile Discourse Group, which those of you will hear a little bit about the Nile Basin Initiative. Those of you know the civil society analog to the formal government process Patricia chaired that civil society process on that transboundary water negotiations. So fascinating to hear her perspective there. And then last but certainly not least, she's a former Africa policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. We were lucky enough to have her for 3 or 4 months this last year. Before we start with the panel and my comments, I'm going to kick it off. I'd like to ask Mario Zus from the German Embassy to come up and say a few introductory remarks so we get the conversation started. So, Mario, if you could come take the floor. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Geoff, for this opportunity, and thank you for the very kind remarks about our role as the German Embassy to co-organize this important event, this panel discussion. We are glad that we were instrumental, and we are really looking forward to the discussion that is going to follow. It is about environment, conflict, and cooperation, and when we say environment, I think nowadays it has become clear that environmental change is meant, and there especially climate change. Climate change has certainly outgrown environmental change as a notion and as an area of concern. And I would like to cite the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan back in 2005, who has referred to climate change as a threat to peace and security that deserves as much attention as the prevention of war or the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And this is one of the reasons. I could now go on and quote from the very many important reports from the scientific area, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the Stern Report, but also this linkage between environmental change, climate change, and security is one of the reasons why the German government has placed this issue of climate change high on the agenda of its EU presidency and the G8 presidency. Our goal is to speed up the international decision-making process to meet this challenge. You may have heard that within the European Union, we have set ourselves already very ambitious climate protection goals. Of course, we are well aware that the European Union cannot do it alone, nor can the United States. But this is a challenge for the globe, I would like to say, and we are looking forward for our partners to join us in this effort. So I hope that today's discussion will help us to better understand the specific linkage between environmental change or climate change and security issues. Or how can environmental cooperation help foster security and stability? These are questions that are certainly going to stay with us, and I think we all look forward to the discussion before us. And therefore, I would like to conclude here after these brief remarks and again cordially invite you to the reception that is being hosted by the German Embassy afterwards, and give the floor to the panelists. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Mario. And I'm going to actually sit here, I think, for the talk, in part because the computer means that my pages kept falling off the screen. So in order to stay relatively organized, I'll sit here and talk. You guys feel free to do whatever you care to do. So today's not going to be a primer in environment, conflict, and cooperation. I've looked very closely at the participants list, and you guys are not, this is not the 101 course sign-up list, so to speak. In fact, this is not even really the graduate course, because many of you could be up here in that kind of sense that this is a course teaching this course. We really have a lot of experts and practitioners who've been working for literally tens of years on these issues. So what we're going to try to do from an American vantage point, a Horn of Africa vantage point, and a European vantage point, talk about some of the trends, analytical, but particularly the policy trends in environment, conflict, and cooperation, talk about what some of the new initiatives are, and really try to talk about some of the windows of opportunity for action. And I think we're actually in some of those. Some of those windows are open, and so it's critical that we we take advantage of it and that we have the kind of discussions that we're having today. You also aren't, from me, and I think from any of us, going to see the kind of causal diagrams that those of you who have come to some of our sessions before have been subjected to, and there's the time and the place for those. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to spare you. I think that there are a number of ways that the models have been tweaked and improved, and I think there would be an interesting conversation that we could have there. I do think we've improved our understanding of the importance of state capacities and state vulnerabilities, and understanding where environmental scarcity or abundance of natural resources do have links to some of the negative outcomes that we'd like to avoid, that we're lumping in as a category of conflict. And I think the focus on those intervening variables that really make the difference of whether the state or the community can take the hit of scarcity and channel that into a way that's not conflictual or a way that's conflictual. A lot of that's in the middle. So I think we have better appreciated that and made progress in that area. We had a session, those of you who might have been here earlier this month, that I think personifies another level of progress, which is we had one that looked, really started to geo-reference environmental data well below the level of the state in a very kind of specific to location. For so long we've been stuck with state level aggregated data to try to understand links between environmental conditions and violence and conflict and cooperation. And that really, of course, as we know, doesn't tell the tale of differences within countries. And so progress there is something that is starting to be made. It's very difficult, and the data limitations are always going to be a challenge, but it is progress. I think we've moved, hopefully, beyond the scarcity versus abundance dichotomy. I think it's a false dichotomy. I think we see these kinds of dynamics where the abundance of a particularly eludable resource, whether it's valuable minerals or forest resources, are playing a role in contributing either to causing a conflict or contributing to causing a conflict, or something that prolongs it because it's lucrative and then can buy arms and keep a conflict going. That set up against a scarcity-driven model of what causes conflict or where environment can play a role. That's been held up as an either or, and I think it's a false dichotomy. Unfortunately, I think for the most part, folks recognize that and moved beyond it. I think most importantly, we moved beyond trying to tease out precisely how these causal connections work and really try to look at some of the policy interventions for breaking some of the links, the negative links, and reinforcing some of the positive links. And we'll talk a lot. You will hear that this panel is biased towards looking at the cooperation side and the cooperative side and trying to find ways to reinforce using environmental management as a pathway to peace in some respects. And so in that sense, I think we're moving the analytical into the realm of the practical and the theoretical into the realm of the action. And so this is, I think, a positive trend. I think we also have come to a state where there's a wider recognition that environmental issues just have to be part of the discussion if we're talking about conflict prevention or post-conflict settings or even at times of conflict. We can debate that, certainly the level of priority that is given, but at least I think we're finding it's more part of the discussion. Because in some sense, after all, environmental management is conflict management. In this sense, conflict doesn't necessarily have to reach the threshold of violent conflict. We've kind of assumed that that's what we're talking about, that more narrow and kind of higher threshold level of violence when we talk about conflict. And obviously, we should be quite concerned when it is that level, that threshold, higher threshold. But I think in some ways, we've missed an important set of discussions where whether we call it small C conflicts or ones that aren't explicitly organized violence, but it's a high-level contestation and tension between groups around managing natural resources. And so the fact that we are starting to pay more attention to that, I think, is quite positive. We need to prioritize research and policy efforts in this broader sense. Mario mentioned climate change, and I think that is also something that's different. And I know Alex will talk about this as well because it's obviously a big topic of conversation in Europe. But I do think it presents some opportunities to go, well, not beyond the kind of economic and environmental discussions that the climate are typically situated in, but to also have this climate and security discussion. I think I don't know whether Sherry Goodman is here. She was signed up to come. She's talked about climate change as a threat multiplier, something that would be interesting to hear, for example, how Patricia sees this larger climate change issue exacerbating some of the conditions that we see in the Horn of Africa, drought and water availability and arable land availability, and the tensions around the scarcity of those, how climate change is going to be an additional weight and factor on that. I think that's a part of the way that we can connect to this environment, conflict, and cooperation discussion. I do think there's a danger to overstating these links. Some of you might have seen recently there was not sure, it was a UK conference that involved folks from the military, where the headline in the newspaper, and again the newspaper, you have to look at the paper, see whether it really is how they're framing it, but it was framed as climate change supports terrorism or creates conditions. There's some danger in oversell, right? And so we can talk about the conditions that climate change are going to produce and how those conditions may be something that are part of an underlying set of issues where these environment and conflict linkages are there. But we need to be careful. In part, we need to learn the lesson that we did the hard way in the 90s about overselling, and when environment was put forward as the national security issue of the 21st century, and particularly the 94 discussion around Robert Kaplan's Coming Anarchy article. For those of you who've been grinding along in this area, you'll remember that well, where it was sold as kind of sliced bread and the solution to our flailing around in a post-Cold War period. And there's a lot of substance there, but we can't say that it's the only story in town, because obviously this is all very complex, and there are a lot of stories that are important. So we need to avoid making that mistake. As I mentioned, and as we've titled this session, we've added cooperation. A lot of times, particularly in the 90s, we just talk about an environment conflict meeting, right? So why the cooperation? Well, one of the things that we've certainly spent a lot of time here at the center, and in collaboration with these two partners as well as a number of others, is trying to turn the discussion in some sense on its head, the environment conflict thesis on its head, and look at environment cooperation and where the interdependencies around environmental issues, where they might play a role in facilitating the cooperation, in some ways the necessity for cooperation that can be this pathway to peace. And that's a kind of ambitious expectation. But the notion that the fact that parties, sometimes across borders, sometimes between communities, sometimes even between households, have to cooperate based on some of these environmental interdependencies, whether it's a river that flows through territories or shared sanitation, susceptibility to poor sanitation in some ways in terms of health, that interdependency can actually be the basis for building trust and building confidence between parties. And so this quote-unquote environmental peacemaking is a direction that we've tried to investigate on the analytical side and understand what's going on the policy side, and in some ways encourage those of you in the policy realm to try it, because it might actually work. But it's hard for us on the analytical side to say this works, this doesn't, if you haven't tried it and given us something to study. There are lots of ways to look at it. I think for me, at least, there are four kind of distinct areas, and both Patricia and Alexander in some ways have been on the ground working in some of these cases, so we'll hear about some of them. But if we think along a conflict continuum, I think there are some interesting roles to look at: environment and environmental dialogue or environmental management in the context of conflict prevention. And so when Patricia talks about the Nile Basin Initiative, obviously it's a basin-wide development enterprise, but how is that dialogue also in the mode of conflict prevention? A second, environment is a lifeline in times of conflict, a lifeline for dialogue. So when all things in the relationship are going poorly, perhaps the kind of shared interest and shared dependency on environmental issues provide an avenue for discussion. Alexander will talk about some of the experiences in the Caucasus where this has been, well, we'll hear whether it's a promising avenue, and this is in part, the jury's still out in some respects, but certainly something worth trying. Environment is a necessary ingredient to ending conflict. So again, our focus on environmental causes of conflict, I think, have blinded us to some degree on where environment may not be what gets you into the conflict, but you got to go through it to get out of it. And so in that sense, India and Pakistan are not at odds over, first and foremost, over sharing water, but by goodness, you have to negotiate that sharing of water in order to get to some sort of a sustainable peace. We've seen that in the Peru-Ecuador case, where kind of part of the peace agreement sets up collaborative environmental management structures to, in part, get yourself to peace. And then a fourth category, environment in a post-conflict setting, or some ways of environment in war-torn societies. We have a couple different names for it. And it's this area particularly, colleagues Erica Weinthal at Duke, Ken Conca at the University of Maryland, and Richard Matthew at UC Irvine, and I, and again, as I said, in collaboration with the partners here, has spent a lot of time trying to understand, in many ways, looking at the standard kind of toolkit our post-conflict folks have, and understanding that environment and natural resource management is critical, particularly in the longer term sustainability of that piece. And we don't have a whole lot of success examples without taking from where we're doing it now. And so part of what we're suggesting is let's look into some of these longer term ways. You need to know whether it's safe to till the field, whether it's safe to drink the water. You can't just hand the forestry ministry over to the rebel group to get them at the negotiation table if you know they're just going to cut down the trees and loot the resources. So how we structure our reconstruction efforts have to integrate some of these natural resource management considerations. They're not luxury items that we leave till later. They're critical to actually sustaining peace, something where what is it? One in two conflicts fall back into post-conflict settings fall back into conflict within 10 years. So it's obviously something where we have a lot of work to do. So how are we doing on the policy initiatives and institutional efforts, environment, conflict, cooperation? A very quick and superficial take on different levels of institutional actors, and this will be my final set of interventions. I think it's a mixed set of trends. I do think there's some real opportunities there, but we have some real challenges to taking advantage of them. Let's say at the international organization level and use the UN as a focus. I think we've heard a lot of the right things from particularly the past Secretary General. I think it's still too early to know where the new one is sitting on these. But we've seen a lot of at the kind of doctrine level, a lot of encouraging signs, as Mario's quote suggested, that environment has got to be part of the discussion if we're in conflict prevention and building and supporting peace. And the creation of the UN Peacebuilding Commission, on the face of it, has some potential in integrating these. I think what folks are saying in terms of as formulating an agenda means that they already feel they're overwhelmed even with a traditional and narrow definition of what they're supposed to do. And so folks are fairly pessimistic about whether these issues will be part of their toolbox, which is, I think, a fairly short-term and short-sighted perspective. Another actor in this UN Environment Program has, again, some useful models that what was the post-conflict assessment unit, which would go in a post-conflict setting and do a scientific objective assessment, and in part try to set up structures that facilitated both sustainable management but also reconciliation among parties, has been fairly ad hoc, has been off budget with kind of specific funders for specific programs. Unclear where that's going to go. I think it's a very valuable service. We've seen the progress that can be made, but really needs to be institutionalized. And again, there's new leadership there, and I think very vigorous leadership, and hopefully that will be something that continues. I should say, Achim Steiner at the head of UNEP, and it's unclear how some of these different UNEP efforts will go forward. Still huge challenges, of course, working across bureaucracies, because as we know, UNEP is not where the money is in the UN system and not where a lot of the big authorities are, and it's in part working across some of the different agencies, and so there are real challenges there. And then, of course, with the Millennium Development Goals really informing where the UN is focusing its attention by the 2015 timeframe, I think it's clear how poverty, and as much as poverty is part of this discussion, which is obviously an integral part of the discussion, that's front and center in the Millennium Development Goals. How it connects to issues of conflict and cooperation is much less clear, and so it's hard to kind of go in and plug into the primary peg that the UN system has. The NGO and academic, just a couple few things to highlight. I think positive developments. One, we had an interesting set of discussions, I think it was at Duke this fall, where we had a couple of representatives from humanitarian organizations with the thought that we can't just be talking within an environmental realm or just a conflict realm. We have to have the development folks at the table, both the short term and the long term. In some ways, some of the International Rescue Committee and CARE folks and Mercy Corps and World Vision, and some of those folks have to be part of this discussion, particularly if we're going to talk about integrating these environmental natural resource management structures into any sort of post-conflict or humanitarian crisis. And it's clear that the timelines, that those organizations are starting to rethink what it means to be humanitarian, do humanitarian work, because in some ways their timelines are going on and on and on and on, if you think of some of these refugee camps that have been there for decades. And so in that sense, adjusting to thinking of themselves as development organizations, and therefore what that brings to the table, and in the sense that they were thinking more broadly in some of these environmental realms, bringing some of these questions of, well, okay, if we're going to be here for as long as we have found ourselves being in some of these other situations, we need to have a different approach to where we site the refugee camp vis-a-vis fuel sources and forests, vis-a-vis national parks, vis-a-vis water and supply and sanitation services. So bringing these things together, I think, is an encouraging sign. I do think on the academic side we are making some progress, and I do think perhaps this is self-congratulatory because we spend so much time on it, but I do think the environmental peacemaking side and turning it on its head is a productive direction. And so trying to understand how that fits, particularly into this post-conflict set of tools is critically important, and really we have a long way to go, so it's more kind of identifying that this is an agenda rather than having made progress on it. And then finally, just to end on the U.S. government, and here it will be, again, kind of by definition superficial because there's so much going on, and the same way we could say adding up to what. I think there is a tremendous window of opportunity. I think the climate change issue presents that. I think that's new. Some of it's the Katrina effect. There are a number of different things going on. Obviously, there's under this new Congress, there's an awful lot more that's being pushed. Certainly, there's greater space and wider participation that in these discussions. I think the intelligence community and the military that was very active in the 90s and then not so active between, say, 2000 2005. Are increasingly active, increasingly participating in these discussions as they did some years back, and I find that encouraging. Two examples. One is the opportunity that's presented by the decision to stand up a new Africa command this fall, and Shannon Beebe is here somewhere from the Department of the Army, a number of colleagues from the Army Environmental Policy Institute who are doing some of the intellectual heavy lifting and how these issues may be integrated into what the portfolio looks like in this new regional command, so Africa Command for the U.S. military, how they organize themselves in the world. I think that is an opportunity that we should not let pass without enunciating how these issues come to play, and in fact, be something that Patricia should be particularly valuable in helping us do. The other is, some of you might have seen last week, Senator Durbin and Senator Haindl dropped a bill entitled the Global Climate Change Security Oversight Act, I think last Wednesday, that is in some ways modest, but is, I think, a terrific first step in reinvigorating the whole government, but with the National Intelligence Council in the lead. They've called for a national intelligence estimate to be done on climate change and security, and understanding what the impacts mean for U.S. security broadly defined, what it means for strategic countries of strategic interest to the United States, both allies but others that may not be allies but are also strategically important, as well as countries that are particularly susceptible to the impacts and least likely to be able to adapt successfully. It calls for an NIE, which I think fortunately will probably happen regardless of whether this bill is turned into law or not. But I think it's terrific that there are opportunities for what would be a government-wide process to have everybody in some way share their notes and share their assessments of how these issues come together. USAID, I'd be remiss to not comment on USAID. They're here in the building, and they're a critical player on these issues. I think if those of us who tried to focus on these issues in the 80s and the 90s in some ways wondered where not just USAID, but where the development agencies around the world were on these issues. And I think in some ways they were one of the last to come to the party. But in a sense, starting in 2000, interestingly, Andrew Natsios, with this Mercy Corps perspective, understood that conflict was a critical part of the development agenda, and that in some ways your development progress could be wiped out if you didn't pay attention to it. And so I think there have been all sorts of initial steps to try to look and integrate conflict considerations and then integrate them with the other traditional agendas in the health and environment and natural resource management and governance and such across these kind of traditional aid priorities. I think that's positive. I think it's proving to be a real challenge to work across departments and even within a given agency and then expand that out to the government. We know that. I think the foreign assistance reform approach, from my perspective, one of the things that it does that's not helpful is it kind of reifies our focus on the bilateral and a country-specific focus and budgets. And so if we're talking about, as we will hear, about potential for transboundary environmental cooperation for larger peace-building processes, when we organize our priorities country by country, it's much harder to do that transboundary or regional approach. And so I think it's unfortunate that we kind of continue and persist with the overwhelming focus on the bilateral. And I'd love to be challenged and corrected on that by somebody in the government that says, no, we still have avenues to do regional and transboundary work. But I fear that that's not the case. So I think it has been the case that we had quite a bit of attention, quite a bit of momentum, quite a few people working on these issues on all these different areas in the 90s. We saw a pause, shall we say, and in some ways, for obvious reasons, there was a lot of attention paid in the wake of 9/11 to some of the more proximate causes of some of these conflicts. And some of the tools to try to break these links. But I am encouraged that there seems to be some momentum to get back on track. That climate change is in the discussion and the attention that's being paid to that. It provides some opportunities, ones that I think can be connected and rightfully discussed in the context of what can be very local settings and cases. I think it's something that the exhibition downstairs does well, and certainly our conversation as it's pitched today is meant to facilitate that discussion and dialogue. So I will end there and turn the floor over to Patricia.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll take it over from where Jeff left, just looking at some experiences that we have in the Greater Horn of Africa and looking at some opportunities that are arising there for using environment and peace, basically bringing the two together for the development of the region. And my outline is basically looking at the context within which this is happening and then bringing to your attention an initiative that the United Nations Environment Program that Jeff was talking about has started, the Environment Conflict Prevention Initiative, and then highlighting some issues about what, as part of that initiative, is happening with the Africa assessment, looking at a protected area which is transboundary and which actually has very critical species, the mountain gorillas, and then the kinds of opportunities that they have been there for both formal and informal cooperation, and then a conclusion. And basically, to start with, I just want to point out that within the Greater Horn of Africa, and actually Africa in general, we have a long history of cooperation and for diverse issues. If you look at river basin management regimes, you have actually initiatives around the major rivers of Africa. The Nile is probably one of the most talked about ones, but actually even around the Zambezi, the Niger, and the Volta, there is cooperation. And then there are regional economic communities which have come together for economic development, again looking at the South African Development Community, ECOWAS, the East African Community, the Common Market for Southern and Eastern Africa. And over and above that, there is the African Union, formerly the Organization of African Unity, which has actually concentrated on conflict prevention and more recently actually management. The experiences in Darfur and also in Somalia are actually telling about the kind of cooperation that we are seeing on the African continent with respect to issues of conflict prevention. Then there's the issue of human rights. Actually, very early on, there is the African Convention on Human and People's Rights, where African countries came together and decided that this was the blueprint along which they were going to manage issues of human rights. And more recently, under that charter, we have an optional protocol on women's rights, which actually brings in issues such as HIV/AIDS and even sustainable development, which very many international agreements don't deal with. Then we have management of transboundary resources within different regions. Whether you're looking at Eastern Africa or Southern Africa, you will see that countries have come together to manage transboundary resources together, whether they be forests, water, or wildlife. And actually, within the Horn of Africa, if you look at the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, formerly Intergovernmental Authority on Drought and Development, there is now a conflict early warning and response mechanism, which, among other things, is also looking at issues of environmental resources as well as differentiations within communities on issues of gender, but also socioeconomics. And even going back to the regional economic communities, most of them have a peace agenda. They have a conflict desk. Whether you're talking about the East African Community, the Intergovernmental Authority on Drought, or the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, they all actually have the conflict desk, which is looking at the way in which conflict actually comes into broader development questions. And at the heart of all this is the realization of the need to link environment, conflict, and cooperation. And because a lot, whether you're talking about economic development for African countries or you're talking about the sustainability of the environments within which people live in, environment is really big. And essentially within that, there's need to develop environment-focused tools to prevent conflict and to manage conflict as well, because that is where people's livelihoods are at, and also that's where the economies of the countries is at. And also exploring ways in which one could use environmental resources to build peace, where peace has broken down. Within the Great Lakes region, and the Great Lakes region here is a big part of the middle of Africa, traversing as far as Sudan and going down right up to Angola. Within that whole region, there is actually broad policy acceptance that there is a link between environmental quality, peace, and security. And this has very high acceptance by policymakers. There is actually an ongoing process of the United Nations Conference on the Great Lakes region. And in 2004, the countries came together and actually came up with a draft declaration which had environment very, very prominently put out on the security agenda. And among the things that the countries pointed out in the declaration is that environmental quality and sustainable natural resource management are preconditions for peace and security in this region. And conversely, peace and security are critical for environmental quality as well as sustainable environmental management, because again, you can't sustainably manage the environment in the absence of peace and security. And here again, they were talking about the need to not only deal with the rights that people have accrued, but to look at equitable access and sharing of benefits, which would lead to more sustainable management initiatives and obviate the competition for natural resource control, which causes conflict. And they would also be looking at identification and support of opportunities that actually lead to environment management for peace. The third and critical element of that political statement was that the countries agreed that political commitment to democracy and good governance are critical for sustainable environmental management. And this is not just at the national levels, or the national and local levels where the resources are found, but also regionally. And they talked a lot about the need to focus on strategic transboundary resources such as lakes, river basins, mountains, and protected areas. And then fourthly, they also talked about the need to have environmental management and protection mainstreamed into economic development and regional integration. And I suppose this is what is happening with the regional economic communities having security in them, and that security being linked to the environment. And finally, they talked about armed conflicts resulting in increased environmental degradation, poverty, unplanned development, and overharvesting of resources, and pointed out that there was need for effective responses. For instance, what Jeff was talking about, where do you locate refugee camps where you have degraded environments, and how do you ensure that that location does not lead to further degradation of resources? And then, given that there is normally host community resentment of refugee communities, how do you create cooperation between the two for environmental management so that the host communities do not see refugees as coming to further degrade their environment when they are actually seen as more protected because they have international organizations providing for them? And it is within that context that the UNEP Environment, Conflict and Prevention Initiative has to be looked at, especially from the African part. And this initiative actually seeks to mainstream environment into the security discourse as part of the Department of Early Warning and Assessments Initiative on Environment and Conflict. And there are 3 regional case study assessments being conducted, one in Latin America and the Caribbean, the other in Asia and the Pacific, and the Africa one, which I will talk a little more about. And all of them actually seek to increase the understanding of ways in which the environment can act as an important catalyst for cooperation, trust building, and conflict prevention. And actually going beyond the macro or the state-to-state statements to how people relate to each other in the management of the environment. Within the African region, the Virunga Conservation Area was chosen because, one, it traverses 3 countries, and in all those countries, the conservation area actually is represented by a national park. And if you look at the broader ecosystem, there is the Bwindi Impenetrable Forest National Park, and this is the habitat for the mountain gorilla, and has been for a long time under severe pressure from people living in and around it because of population density, human encroachment, poaching, deforestation, as well as the civil unrest in that area. And in fact, this whole area is blamed for the proliferation of bushmeat trade because of increased poaching. And you see a lot of newspaper articles on how many gorillas are killed for meat. And that actually is a threat to these rare species of gorillas. And then there are also refugee camps located in the region. That would be the geographical coverage of the Virunga area. There is the DRC, where you have the Parc National de Virunga, and then you have the Rwanda side and the Uganda side. And what one sees there is diverse interests at play. And I suppose here one is looking at how do you, when you're faced with diverse interests, still focus on environment, conflict, and cooperation. First of all, you have protected areas managed by different states. And for those of you that are familiar with protected area management systems in Africa, they tend to be paramilitary in their way of operation and very much separated from the people. So it would be the park authorities and the people. And here again, you're talking about park areas that have different states. So there is the sovereignty question and political boundaries questions. Then there is the second interest, where you have a lot of conservation agencies with work in this area, again because of the species found there, but a lot of them are actually working on the mountain gorillas. And then you have resource extracting companies, you have pharmaceutical companies seeking resources for drug development, you have mining, you have logging companies, and in some places you even have fishing villages. And then fourthly, the park is seen as a refuge and strategic target for militias in times of conflict, which offers them cover and an escape route. And then you have the surrounding communities who are not homogeneous, and who, first of all, because of population increase, but also because of climate change and diminished environments, also the lack of safety, they are seeking to eke out a livelihood in not very easy circumstances. So basically then, one would be looking at how do you bring all these interests together. And as far as state-to-state cooperation is concerned, there is already a context. We've looked at the United Nations Conference on the Great Lakes. There is the African Union. Then there is the Nile Basin Initiative, the initiative of about 10 African states coming together to manage the River Nile, and within the context that people saw that there was going to be war because of the waters of the Nile, and that has largely been diffused because of the countries coming together and agreeing on cooperative management of the water resources. Then there is the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment. Again, the countries have a shared history of violence and conflict. And within that broad context, there is also informal transboundary cooperation in the management of protected areas. Here, you have cooperation through local consultation. I suppose when you're neighbors with a person, whether you want to avoid them or not, you will always have to deal with them because you face the same dangers. What is happening across the fence, if there is a fence, will impact on what happens on your side of the property. And here you see grassroots liaisons, building familiarity and mutual trust, promoting close contact between local communities, and supporting flexible and innovative approaches to local development. And these have been seen as creating a basis and providing an incentive for upgrading the cooperation from informal to formal. At the quasi-formal level, there is field-level cooperation between administrative authorities, such as the park managers, in terms of park patrols, and also in terms of management of wildlife. But there is also formal cooperation, which is specific to the Virunga area. And this formal cooperation is most principally in the form of the 2005 Tripartite Declaration on Transboundary Natural Resource Management of the Central Albertine Rift, covering the three countries, that is DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda, and looking at having effective management of the shared resource, which is the Virunga ecosystem, to ensure that the resources in there are sustainably managed. But more importantly, it's not just looking at managing the ecosystem for the mountain gorillas. It's also looking at contributing to conservation of biodiversity for the common goal of poverty reduction in the three countries. Because if you're just talking about protecting the natural habitat for wildlife, then you create conditions for conflict with people who may actually think that the wildlife is favored more than the people who may be languishing in poverty. There is no normative legal framework, but the affirmation of efforts to coordinate and collaboratively manage these protected areas as one ecosystem under a transboundary strategic plan is a sign of positive things that will happen in this area. In fact, the states have undertaken to initiate development of a collaborative protocol to ensure formal agreement for a transboundary protected area network. And the question that we are asking within the Africa assessment is whether this cooperation could lead to the establishment of a transboundary protected area or peace park. And again, looking at successes of those in the Southern African region. And the idea here is to maximize on the peace dividend that the transboundary management of the park would yield. The African assessment is still ongoing. So basically, as you might imagine, and within such a big area and an area which is not very accessible, we are still going on with mapping different actors and their roles in the environment conflict cooperation, looking at states, local communities, international organizations, private sector actors, and of course there are illegal actors, and looking at what motivates illegal actors is also important, so as to look at what are the sorts of perverse incentives that there are that actually militate against environment conflict and cooperation. Another issue that we're looking at within this context is how does gender play within the environment conflict and cooperation. And in fact, not just looking at gender, but also looking at youth, the intra and intergenerational questions in environment conflict cooperation. And then looking at what kinds of data there is that one might look at when you're looking at environment conflict and cooperation, and what data is not there. And it's almost clear that when you, for instance, want to look at data on gender, it's totally absent, because the level at which the data is pitched is too high. You will not be able to see the intra and inter-community interactions. There is therefore need to explore more localized and informal cooperative arrangements, because it is at that level that you will see the common values which make environment conflict cooperation possible among stakeholders. And this is the work that we will continue to do within this region, and hopefully also identify other ecosystems that would be able to give us more case studies for the environment conflict cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, to you and your colleagues for bringing the exhibition here to Washington, and also thanks to the German Embassy to invite me and to give me the chance to share some thoughts with you on recent developments in Europe. We're talking about a Europe of 27 member states, and I won't go through all of them. But one question that I would like to address is whether the debate on environment, conflict, and cooperation has changed over the past couple of years at the European level. And talking about the European level, I mean at the level of the European Commission and also within and among EU member states. I would say yes, it did, significantly. And I would like to just mention 4 topics that are quite high on the agenda these days. One is conflict resources, so bringing transparency to the extractive industry. Second, of course, is climate change, but not climate change in general, but looking at climate change risks and threats to security, and to start thinking about not only about the impacts, but how would a climate change policy look, and would it look different if we frame it in foreign and security policy terms. Third debate, ongoing debate, is on, Patricia mentioned, environment mainstreaming into security discourse. Yes, it is about this, but it's also about conflict mainstreaming of sectoral programs and projects. And the fourth is on environmental peacemaking, so using intentionally environmental cooperation across borders as a tool for confidence building, basically in post-conflict settings. And I would like to concentrate on the last 3. Some of these issues were discussed in more depth last week, Thursday and Friday in Berlin, because the 3 ministries for environment, development cooperation, and foreign policy under the EU Council presidency conducted a 2-day conference on integrating environment, development, and conflict prevention to talk about European challenges and to explore where the different EU member states are. It is important because it is kind of a symbol that under a council presidency this subject has been addressed, because it might end up probably not in the council conclusions, but at least in an annex. This is how policy making, among other things, work in Europe. It is important, and there is a new momentum and dynamic in Europe, because if we look back over the past 10 years, you have individual member states like the UK or Germany coming up with initiatives on the extractive industries, EITI, or Publish What You Pay, and you have the Germans pushing for the promotion of renewable energies and putting climate change into a security context. But what was lacking is an active role that the European Commission was playing. There were several reasons why the European Commission did not succeed in picking them up, but that has changed. So the European Commission seemed to embark to address these issues in much more detail and in a systematic way. The number one theme is conflict resources, so I just would like to briefly explain what this is about. I think there is nothing special and nothing new to the debate. You might have heard that under the German EU Council presidency and German G8 presidency, extractive industry is one of the very prominent topics that they have on their agenda, also for the upcoming summit. It is supported by a couple of member states, namely Belgium and the United Kingdom. It is about basically bringing transparency to the extractive industry sector. It builds on a couple of mechanisms that are in place, basically the Kimberley process that creates a regulatory regime for raw diamonds, about initiatives of Publish What You Pay and Extractive Industries Transparency International, which are private-public partnerships and initiatives in order to bring transparency to that part of the industry. And it builds on the Forest Law and Governance and Law Enforcement and Governance and Trade program, which is a quite broadly based program pushed by the European Commission and EU member states in order to address illegal logging questions and trafficking of timber products. The main aim is to explore whether initiatives such as the Kimberley process could be transferred to other conflict commodities and basically strategic minerals. And initially it has been a rather technical debate on whether we can probably use that mechanism and shift that and apply that to the timber sector. And it has been quite obvious that the timber market is much more intransparent. It's much broader. We are talking about a broader range of issues. So we have to think in different terms, and that led the debate and extended the debate about a regulatory regime to bring in a whole debate on capacity building in those resource-dependent countries. So when we talk about, under G8 presidency, about conflict resources and regulatory regimes, that has been broadened. I think there are two major things that need to be mentioned. One is, you might have heard of the initiative by Global Witness as one of the two major NGOs who are pushing for that, beside Transparency International, who lobby for a unified and globally accepted definition of what conflict resources are, because in recent experience with the UN Security Council, it has been always a long way to go in order to agree on sanctions by the global community within the UN system, and you cannot wait for a couple of years whenever there's a case you would like to, where you would like to use the power and negotiation power and also the pressure that the UN system can build. That is one thing. The other thing is, as I have mentioned, to really combine these regulatory efforts with a lot of the debate on corporate social responsibility and capacity building in developing countries. Why this debate is so important for the environment, conflict and cooperation discourse among EU member states and at the level of the EU Commission is that it was far more obvious to talk about conflict resources and the extractive industries, and also understandable, as if you compare that to the more constructive idea of root causes of conflicts, that is, at least some policymakers are less susceptible to that thesis. So they do see things like blood diamonds or blood cell phones, if you think in terms of coltan, that is used in these telephones, that it helped really to bridge and initiate a debate within government agencies on the broader implications of global environmental change. The second issue is on climate change, and basically the one question: what are the consequences of climate change in security terms? There has been a huge debate in Europe. You might have heard that just 6 weeks ago the Council of Environment Ministers agreed on quite ambitious targets. Mr. Soos mentioned that already, the triple targets of increasing until the year of 2020 the portion of renewable energies by 20%, to reduce greenhouse gases by 20%, and to reduce energy consumption in the European Union by 20%. Ambitious targets, and if you combine that with the recent Stern report on the devastating economic consequences of climate change, that created a lot of acceptance of climate change policies. The question is, if you ask policymakers really to, when they put that into the context of security threats, whether climate change policies would look different. And that is one question that we addressed in this European conference last year, and we had representatives also of the UK government, and John Ashton, as the chief climate change diplomat of the Commonwealth Office, introduced one initiative of the UK government to launch a debate in the UN Security Council on climate change and energy security. It's the first time that the Security Council will address explicitly climate change and environmental issues and resource issues, in basically addressing 6 different areas where climate change might have significant impacts on security. One is the impact it might have on border disputes, basically, as borders may disappear. It might have impacts on migration and refugee. It might have impacts on energy supply, and touches the whole question of energy security, about conflict resources and scarcity of natural resources, about vulnerability of states, and finally on humanitarian crisis and the increase of humanitarian crisis. And I guess if I compare that with the debate that Jeff touched on environmental scarcity and conflict, and if I compare that to the debate that we have at the moment, I think we have to be very careful in what we are talking about, because when you talk to environmental policymakers, they often use that argument of devastating security threats and security risks that emerge from climate change in order to stress the importance and relevance of global environmental policy in general. But I guess to use this as a successful argument, I think at the end we should have different policies, or at least we should have different stakeholders on the table to design and implement the different response mechanisms. So one question, if we look beyond Kyoto, probably you never looked beyond Kyoto, but Europeans did it. How would climate change policy look like after 2012? And we recently had a debate with foreign policy makers, and they said, yes, indeed, it would look completely different, because probably not the instruments we are using, but basically the way we discuss that and the kind of alliances that may emerge. One of the issues that we are discussing in terms of development cooperation and also economic cooperation in Europe is how we deal with the so-called BRICS country, or outreach, or O5 countries, which is China, India, South Africa, Mexico, and Brazil. So emerging economies which have a major impact on global structural policy, which are dominating regional markets, etc. And it turned out to be very difficult for policymakers, not only in Germany, really to talk to them about global climate change, because they fear that they will put emission caps again on the agenda, something they don't want to discuss, because they fear that that limits their economic development. So putting that in broader foreign policy terms and security policy terms, it became much more attractive to them to talk jointly with their partners on an equal level about the future feature of both climate change, but also to link that to the energy debate and talk about energy security and supply of energy. So that is a discourse that is going on. I'm pretty sure that this would offer new windows of opportunities, but that is one of the outcomes of the conference last week, that it is one of the duties of the governments, of EU governments, and specifically foreign policymakers, to think much more in detail how a climate change policy under security and foreign policy considerations would look like. Patricia was talking about environmental mainstreaming. I would like to talk in that third part about conflict mainstreaming and conflict-sensitive programming. I mean, if I look at countries, what they do, and for the preparation of the conference that I have mentioned, we did a survey on how EU member states approach this environment, conflict, and cooperation nexus. There's one thing that turned out in that survey. We just have received half of the questionnaires, but it also involves interviews there with key representatives of various ministries in EU member states, is that they do recognize environment, natural resources, and conflict prevention as a cross-sectoral approach, and they tend to include that into rather broad strategies and strategic documents. In Germany, we have the action plan for civil crisis prevention. You have in different other countries broader efforts on including sustainable development and development issues per se into conflict prevention strategies. One of the problems that occur if you put that into these broader perspectives of linking natural resource management, development, and conflict prevention is that you lose ownership and you lose leadership. That is one of the problems that we face at the moment. If I'm looking at our program for civil crisis prevention and post-conflict rehabilitation in Germany, is that is signed off by the entire government with 165 or 69 activities that are included in this plan. But nobody is accountable for that. So there is a report to the parliament what they have done, but you cannot really go to one minister and say what you have done and really to do lobbying and really to push that. So that is one of the problems that something that not the blame on the Wilson Center, but like Jeff DeBalco and his colleagues and myself included, were lobbying over years really to design more integrated approaches on this subject, that as soon as you have a policy in place, the broader it becomes, then the more difficult it becomes really to then also implement that. If you then look in terms of conflict mainstreaming, we were talking about environment, foreign policy makers, but also the development policy community, is that if you look at 8 agencies, they have programs in place, they have conflict mainstreaming strategies, they have tools of conflict sensitivity assessments, conflict impact assessments, indicators that they have built. They have mechanisms in place like the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, where they share that with other participating states. But the problem is, and this is what we have learned not only from that inventory, but also bilateral talks that we had with the agencies, because they approach us quite often to help them in order to make their programs more conflict sensitive, that it does not really translate into the very practical level. We just came back from a mission to the Southern Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, where we traveled for 2 weeks in order to help the German government to develop a regional environmental program to bring the three states together to cooperate on environmental issues. That was the task, and they had a bunch of civil servants working for 8 agencies and also some NGOs, IUCN, WWF, assisting and identifying opportunities for transboundary nature conservation efforts. And over the past 2 weeks, where we had talks with all ministers there, both for economic development, for environment, for regional planning, that nobody asked whether that is feasible. I mean, we learned from the ministries that they had no idea and no interest really to cooperate, especially when we talk about Armenia and Azerbaijan. There was no conflict analysis included into this program because there's the political will and belief that nature protection efforts across borders might serve as an entry point to bring countries closer. But I will come back to that issue, specifically that example, later on. So something that we have learned, and I guess that is something where policymakers in some instances, at least in the development community, were much quicker, is that they have developed quite sophisticated tools, but as I say, they do not translate down to the practical level. But what is far more important, if you talk to environment ministries across Europe, they don't know anything about conducting conflict-sensitive programming. So they are familiar with the term do no harm, but they just don't know how to really conduct and how to assess that. It's also a question of capacities, because you need technical experience, you need qualified civil servants who can do that, but also, of course, you need some financial resources. And I guess if that instrument of using environment as a peace-building effort and to apply do no harm, which is a standard policy across Europe for all sectoral policies, seriously, I guess we have to bridge some institutional gaps in order to allow that the knowledge that is accumulated within the US, the 8 agencies, also at USAID, to really transfer also to other policy sectors. And the mechanisms that we have in place is the CPDG, that's the Conflict Prevention and Development Group of the OECD, where all the development policy makers meet, and we have an equivalent for foreign policy makers. It's a GDN, the Green Diplomacy Network in Europe, where all the environmental desks of the Foreign Office meet twice a year to discuss over a couple of days efforts related to global environmental issues, predominantly to climate change, and we push them right now through various directions and mechanisms in order to address that question of natural resource management and conflict prevention. What is new, and I mentioned that already, is that in a way they have been surpassed by the European Commission, because that was one of the constraints over the past couple of years, that the debate did not emerge because the Commission itself didn't do anything about that subject. And they have changed a lot of things. First of all, recently they commissioned a study on natural resource and conflict prevention, looking at the external relations of the European Union, specifically at what the so-called RELEX, the External Relations Family, is doing, Directorate General, External Relations, Trade, Development, and Environment. And to explore policies and capacities and to analyze to what extent they are well equipped in order to address these challenges of natural resources and conflict. One of the things that emerged, but just as a side remark, is that after 9/11, Commission policy and external relations shifted completely from prevention to conflict mitigation and post-conflict intervention. That was quite obvious, is not only an outcome of our study, but also other studies, that the Commission realized that they have to stress that far more. And why they are so much interested in this natural resource and conflict linkage is because they believe that looking at natural resource as a source of conflict, but also entry point for cooperation, might offer an opportunity in order to strengthen, again, this kind of preventative efforts. Interesting is we talk a lot about interagency cooperation, both at within our countries, but also at the community level. And they have set up a so-called inter-service group on natural resources and conflict prevention, where several different directorate generals are supposed to cooperate. They had their initial meeting, or some informal meetings yet. And one of the things they are discussing are the outcomes and recommendations of that study for the European Commission, to what extent they pick up one of those 16 recommendations that have been provided. There is an interesting mechanism in place. It's called the Conflict Prevention Network, CPN, It is funded by the European Parliament, and its intention is to offer a variety or a group of 10 major networks of NGOs and think tanks to work on conflict prevention and conflict mitigation issues, and to make this knowledge available to the European Commission. So it's a framework where a bunch of research institutions and network provide their knowledge about conflict-sensitive programming and other things to the European Commission. But as it is important really to bridge the gap between the Commission and also the Member States, they have created a further instrument which is called Peace-Building Partnership under the new Stability Instrument of the European Commission. Or the European Union. Peace-building partnership is a network and mechanism that allows dialogue not only between the Commission and civil society, but also among member states. That is important because there's very little dialogue on these foreign policy issues, but also on nature conservation issues between the Commission and the member states, and to bring that together. The fourth institutional setting is the so-called Natural Resource Conflict Facility. It has been set up recently, not yet formally announced, but will be soon in the next couple of days. It is a mechanism that allows assessment of policies that are funded by the European Commission, but also assessments on impact assessments up to mediation of environmental conflicts. So that is a new instrument. And finally, the Commission is thinking about having a so-called green paper, which is a quite interesting instrument that the Commission has available in order to launch a broader dialogue on policy relevance, not only within the Commission, but also with the Member States. So it's very likely that they're going to have a green paper on natural resource conflict prevention and peace building. It depends a little bit on the outcome of that conference last week and to what extent we can convince our government and some other European governments in order to push the European Commission in order to go into this direction. So last couple of remarks I would like to make on this environmental peacemaking. Jeff, you were asking about the relevance for transboundary environmental cooperation and environmental peace building, what that would mean for post-conflict settings. And something that I was learning is that environmental peace building is basically always about post-conflict settings, because when we look at the regions where that played a major role, Southern Caucasus, you made the case of Ecuador, look at Korea as the peace park or buffer zone, or look at Southern Africa and the peace parks and the Peace Park Foundation, look at the Middle East. I mean, these are not areas where we can talk about preventive diplomacy, but these are war-torn societies. And I guess especially in these areas, environmental cooperation is often used in order to build trust, create dialogue among society in an area which is normally at least less disputed. The question that I always had is whether this environmental peacemaking or peace building is a constructive idea. It might be, I don't know. But at least it seemed to be very catchy for policymakers, because if you talk to policymakers all over Europe, they all raised their hands and said, well, we have a bunch of initiatives on environmental peacemaking around the world. And in that action plan on crisis prevention and post-conflict rehabilitation of the German government, there's an entire chapter on environment and natural resources and energy, and half of that chapter is full on the environment and environmental cooperation projects. I was looking at the lessons learned, and you, Patricia, mentioned a couple of them. Just 6 of them that I would like to briefly name is, first, if you look at environmental peacemaking, there's a clear indication that we have to shift away from project funding to a process orientation. We need significant long-term financial commitment. We just had a debate there on I don't know if the peace process in Northern Ireland will be really successful, but at least there are good signs at the moment. But if you look at the investment and facilitation of cultural dialogue among younger citizens, also environmental dialogue, there was a trust fund set up and filled with $1 billion to facilitate that process. If you compare that to the quite marginal funding of most of the so-called environmental peace-building efforts, I think that is one of the lessons learned to be successful, that we need not only long-term but also significant financial commitment. Third lessons learned is multi-track approaches, so not only having state-to-state dialogue, but also people-to-people dialogue and engaging civil society. We need strong political institutions and some kind of political framework. As for the Peace Park Foundation, I think in Southern Africa, it is, there are many reasons why it's successful, but we have SADC as a political institution that is at least behind and creates ownership. We have to combine this kind of nature protection effort, in that case of peace parks, with opportunities for economic development and incentives and income alternatives. We have to conduct at a certain stage also impact assessment, whether this kind of environmental cooperation really resulted in any kind of political peace process or societal peace process. And I think one of the test cases, because I mentioned already the Southern Caucasus, is environmental cooperation in the Southern Caucasus. The German government is heavily investing through their development agencies and KfW Development Bank into the creation of peace parks across the Southern Caucasus. I think the chances are quite good because we have an institutional framework which is called the European Neighborhood Policy Initiative, or the European Neighborhood Policy. It does not only include the Southern Caucasus, but also the Middle East, the Mediterranean, Maghreb, Moldova, Belarus, and the Ukraine. But the way it functions is basically it has a very strong reference to security and peace in the region, to consider that we have to develop an alternative development path for our European neighbors without offering them accession status. That within that regional approach, transboundary environmental cooperation seemed to play a major role. We have heavy financial investment. These countries receive annually some 90 million euros. I mean, it's not a huge amount of investment compared to other countries that signed accession agreements with the European Union, but at least there will be heavy investment also on environment. It creates a framework that somehow a pathway that bilateral donors can follow. It allows coordination among donor agencies. But at the core, it's still the question whether these environmental peacemaking initiatives, especially with regard to Armenia and Azerbaijan, really result in any kind of peacemaking, because these countries just don't want that. And one of the reasons they don't want that is that when we talk about environmental peacemaking, we often talk about regional approaches to that. We don't talk about bilateral cooperation, but really to put that in a regional perspective. And I guess one of the shortcomings, and I guess there are good reasons to criticize the initiative at that stage, because it's early enough and it's significant enough, it will have major impacts in the region, is that the European Commission and the EU member states really designed or defined regional in traditional boundaries of sovereignty. So when we talk about regional cooperation, they expect that countries like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan cooperate. But if you have an eco-regional approach, which is at the heart of environmental peacemaking, and you look at the mountain trail of the Southern Caucasus, that stretches much beyond those three countries. If you look at the Black Sea on the one hand and the Caspian Sea on the other hand, I think there are good opportunities really to extend the notion of regional approaches and to broaden the perspective. So this kind of environmental peacemaking idea, with all the lessons learned, I guess they do apply for that. I think it's a European test case. We do lobby that, and that's the combination of the last two remarks that I had made about conflict mainstreaming and environmental peacemaking, that some of the mechanisms that we have in place in order to assess policies and impact of policies will be applied also in this environmental peacemaking test case of the Southern Caucasus and under the European Neighborhood Policy Initiative. Just to finalize that, I wanted to just refer to a question that was raised, whether we should combine this dialogue on energy security, climate change risks, conflict resource and environmental peacemaking. That was one of the debate within the European Union, whether that would bring us forward and to have a more structured debate. I think, no, we shouldn't do that. And I have listened to government representatives also saying that the agenda is already overloaded, and given the problem that we have with ownership and leadership, we rather keep these dialogues separate. We can combine one with each other, but we should keep that separate. Second question is, does climate change and security nexus already result in a different way of thinking or policy urgency? Yes, I think it underlined policy urgency. It helped us thinking in different ways, and I guess the session at the UN Security Council on April 17 will kick off and intensify a very structured debate, because the UK government is pushing for that within the European Union. But it did not result in different policy measures and the way we are addressing that, and also new alliances that we would wish for. So I guess there are more opportunities than we have used. Is there a driver of change in Europe? Yes, I think the European Commission is becoming a driver because they have created a quite sophisticated institutional setting for interagency cooperation, but also linking natural resource policies with conflict prevention. And finally, is that a subject for a continuation? I would say not per se a transatlantic dialogue on that subject. For us personally, yes, I hope, and I'm pretty sure that we continue our debate. But I guess it is becoming a far more important subject for a transatlantic, also political dialogue, because having climate change and natural resource management at the core of an emerging European foreign and security policy, I guess makes it quite relevant to intensify also a transatlantic dialogue on that. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you, Alex. We have a little bit of time for some Q&A. I have colleagues, Karen and Sean, who actually, I should say thank you, have worked an awful lot to make today possible with the exhibition, the meeting. They have microphones that I'll ask that you'll use those. Let us know who you are and where you're coming from. We ask you to use the microphone so the folks online can hear your questions as well. So why don't we start up here, Ambassador?
Thank you. My name is David Scheer. I'm the chairman of the board of the Jane Goodall Institute, formerly with USAID. First of all, it was an extraordinary range of broad subjects, I think quite brilliantly described by the panel, and I commend you all for it. At the same time, I'd like to suggest two very practical applications which we have seen in very different environments. One in the GDRC, north of Goma, where the Jane Goodall Institute, in cooperation with the Jane Fossey Group, have been working at the community level very successfully in very disrupted areas by identifying livelihoods, sustainable development, and community cooperation in very successful ways. Obviously, this has to be placed within a much larger context of regional and national governance, but I think working from very practically at the community level on sustainable development through cooperation and through the application of good science is very important. The other is a very different example, and that's in the American Southwest, and this is the application of science biology by the Nature Conservancy, and the quite remarkable work they've done in preservation of some rangelands, cooperation between ranchers, communities, the utilization of water and grassland. It's a process which has a methodology, I think, which is much more broadly applicable, and one I hope you will all look at. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you very much, David. We've here at the Wilson Center followed JGI's work in this area very closely and appreciate your leadership on that. One question maybe we can continue in discussion either here or later is was recently in Ethiopia, and I think it's ripe for some of the very same integrated health and development and poverty and conservation programs. But looking around the country, the big environmental conservation NGOs are not there, in part because it doesn't have the biodiversity hotspot aspect that the Congo does, which is, I think, a challenge because there's certainly tremendous need there. But Patricia, I don't know. In fact, maybe what we do, since we don't have so much time, I've broken my own rules here of gathering a couple questions and then giving the panelists an opportunity to respond. So why don't we gather a couple more and then we'll give folks a chance over here and then down to John.
Hi, my name is Francine Madden. I'm from the Human-Wildlife Conflict Collaboration, which is a new interdisciplinary collaboration among about 70 different organizations. I worked for a number of years in Bwindi, Impenetrable National Park, and first I want to say I really appreciated everything you were saying, and I think it, even though I didn't hear anyone say anything about human-wildlife conflict during this talk, it all applies very much, and I'm hearing a lot of commentary that we need to go not just from the state-to-state level, but from people-to-people level, and find a way to build peace at sort of the basic units between people and between communities. And I think looking at human-wildlife conflict is certainly one way of doing that. And when I was working in Bwindi on human mountain gorilla conflict, it was an issue that was not being addressed across the 3 countries that had mountain gorillas until I organized a workshop and brought all those people together. But there was so much animosity at the local community level, and something that I just thought of after this discussion was that when Bwindi was invaded by the Interahamwe in 1999, the community stayed quiet. They knew it was going to happen. And I have to wonder if part of the reason why the Interahamwe were allowed to come in to that community had something to do with the fact that the community were not getting the benefits that they had hoped that would come from tourism. And yes, they were getting some benefits from tourism, but if you talk to the communities, and a number of researchers came in and did assessments on this, even though they were getting the benefit sharing, even though they had tourism, their number one complaint was about human wildlife conflict and the fact that mountain gorillas were coming out of the parks and raiding people's crops and attacking people. And so there is a huge link there, and I hope that there is more energy going to this people-to-people level.
Terrific. Thank you very much. John, if you could bring it down to John.
I'm John Sewell. I'm here at the Wilson Center. I'm going to be very telegraphic because this was a very rich presentation, but I'm struck, Dr. Karias, by your description of what's happening in Europe as contrasted to what's happening in the United States, and have you really embedded what has been a concern about environment within the rest of the foreign policy community, within countries or within the EU, because here our experience was, I think, even under the Clinton administration, which was verbally highly committed to environmental issues, that as far as the normal range of diplomats was concerned, it had very little impact because it wasn't a sufficient priority unless you were charged and working in that particular office. And in terms of country relationships, it was not an issue. And what has happened within that? Secondly, in the U.S. context, and Jeff can speak to this if he wishes, that the danger of connecting environmental security and conflict is that you're going to bring the Department of Defense into this in a big way. Now, as a result of Afghanistan and Iraq, a considerable part of what the U.S. reports as development assistance is coming out of the Pentagon budget. And it's in the absence of action by other players within the U.S. government, as well as the fact they've got a huge budget. And there's a danger here that you will militarize the issues. And this may be just a U.S. issue. But it would be nice to know that. Third quick point is that how do you link this to what's going on in Doha? The EU does have a trade policy. There is no individual European country trade policy, as you know. And the impact of what happens within Doha on agriculture and various other things is going to have a huge environmental impact. Finally, I'm being very short here, is one of the real problems with the EU is the EU's own development agency disperses extraordinarily slowly. And I'm not sure that's been overcome by its new leadership. I happen to be looking at the figures for aid for trade, of which the EU has pledged a huge amount of money, but the amount that's actually being dispersed is well under 8% per year, and the rest of it's backlog in the bureaucracy of the European Development Fund.
Okay. Well, Sean, keep your word. Yeah.
Thank you. It was excellent presentation. We appreciate your time and effort. My name is Heather Jeffen. I have a small consulting firm in Northern Virginia, Fairfax. Alexander, you mentioned something about natural resources, and you indicated that the natural resources is preserved through the environment, but many of us who work in development felt like natural resources could be blessing or curse, and often it's the other way around. In addition, one of the major report came from United Nations as far as discussing the causes of problem, war, and all other things in environmental impact is exploitation. And I don't see any of you has mentioned that at all in the presentation. How do you curb the exploitation? How do you preserve natural resources from the aggressor who just feel they have the power, then they can confiscate and take it over? Those are major issues in environment.
Terrific. I'll take Len Hirsch one more, and then we'll have the panel respond.
Thanks. Len Hirsch from the Smithsonian. I think if we take all three sets of conclusions and sort of pull them together, I'm struck that you basically defined what did you call them? The building principles that Elinor Ostrom came up with on common property management. Having nested projects, having it long-term, sustainable, having impact assessment, et cetera. And I'm wondering if it would be worth, at some point in time, actually reverse engineering what Lynn did in coming up with those design principles for good common property management, and see if you could use them to actually define a better cross-boundary management program for a peace park or for a watershed management sort of area. And I think, because I heard you've come up with it yet again, and it may be more a proactive thing that can be done.
Terrific. Thank you, Len. That's an excellent point. Patricia, would you like to kick us off, and you can choose which ones work best for you, and then Alexander, we can try to cover the range of them.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to comment on the human-wildlife conflicts. And I think talking about wildlife in the African context without talking about human-wildlife conflict leaves a whole picture out. And I suppose it's moving the discussion to those lower levels, because it's not just in Burundi. Actually, in a lot of the countries, Tanzania and Kenya probably have a lot more wildlife than Uganda, and there's a lot of human-wildlife conflict there. And in fact, like in Kenya, there's the discussion about whether the government is more responsive to wildlife than it is to people. And what people then do is take their own lives in their hands and will actually go out and protect themselves from problem animals. So there's a sense in which putting in place mechanisms to manage this is also a way of having the management of conflicts that arise from the management of natural resources such as wildlife. And I think the whole question of benefit sharing is also at the heart of it. Who benefits? And even when people benefit, again, I'll give the example of Kenya, where we are right now going through a process of putting in place a wildlife policy. And it's clear that benefits from wildlife-based tourism would go, you have something like 56 billion shillings annually from wildlife-based tourism. But people don't link that to what the government does for them. And in fact, they will be saying that we want a share of the revenue. And when you ask them, what about the development monies that comes from another part, they don't see it as coming from the wildlife. So essentially, there is a problem there in linking wildlife to the national development. Then there's the whole issue of community initiatives. I think at the end of my presentation, I talked about the need to go from the very high levels where you have state to state, or you have the next level, which may be region to region, but at the lowest levels where the resources are found, the resources that we're talking about are found, that's where you have the communities. And I think it's very important to have these community initiatives, the kinds of initiatives that Jeff is talking about, being necessary in countries such as Ethiopia. And I would say for a lot of the African countries, that would be something that would enable one to see the clearer linkages that there are between environment, conflict, and cooperation. And especially when you begin to look at within communities, I think again I pointed out that communities are not homogeneous. How do people within communities relate to one another, and in relating to one another then link to environment and conflict, and how can cooperation in their relationship then lead to sustainable environmental management?
Alexander?
One remark on the importance of this nexus of natural resources and conflict, and also putting climate change into this foreign policy realm. There was the Governing Council of the United Nations Environment Program earlier this year. That was in early February. And there were several environment ministers coming back and said, we don't succeed. I mean, we have to put it on the desk of our chancellors and prime ministers. Otherwise, we are lobbying for something that we do already for years. And there were several circumstances that our Chancellor, Angela Merkel, picked up that issue. And I guess that was some kind of interplay with having our Chancellor being convinced basically by the European Commission really to take that up for the German Council presidency. And on the other hand, having our foreign minister concentrating very much on energy security and energy supply issue, which then is this kind of interplay between both. So it's not by the foreign policy or the foreign ministry itself that picked that up and further developed that discourse. But it's more the interplay that I try to describe also, and why it is necessary really to have the European Commission, because without having any kind of pressure of developing programs at the Commission level, then it's difficult really for member states to act themselves. You asked one question on the role of EU trade agreements. We assessed them also, or looked at EU trade agreements. We have a bunch of them in place. To what extent they are effective in serving as an instrument for also conflict prevention. I mean, it was not the task really to do the assessment, but we looked at the so-called sustainability impact assessments, which is a mechanism that is applied to trade agreements. And we explored that you can easily really extend, with integration of do no harm principles, the assessment of trade agreements. But I can tell you that the European Commission, when they are discussing that at the moment, what kind of recommendation they should pick up, they would definitely not pick up that very specific recommendations that we made in order to conduct peace and conflict impact assessment of trade agreements. Something that would be important and necessary, but I guess there are reasons that you understand that they won't probably start with this very challenging thing. One question that you have raised, why we have not addressed this question of alternative pathways of resource exploitation. I mean, this is the example, and my understanding of the debate, I'm not a conflict resources expert, that the debate on conflict resources at the moment under German EU Council presidency, but also in the G8, shifted really away of just having a very narrow perspective of having regulatory systems that you can apply to other commodities, not necessarily conflict commodities, but also to stress, or furthermore to stress the question of capacity building for the protection of natural resources in these countries. But, I mean, there are two cases which definitely show the limitations of any kind of intervention, and intervention also in the sense of capacity building. One thing is that the EU member states, 8 agencies are basically complaining that what they have done over the past 10 to 15 years in Nigeria is basically dissolved because now you have another big player, China, is coming in there, and the government not only of Nigeria is very receptive to what the Chinese companies bring them in terms of income. But that demonstrates a little bit the limitations, and we see a similar trend at the moment from a country I just came from in Georgia, where we had not only EU member states but also IUCN and WWF working on park management and the protection of domestic forests, but there's a new law in place on environmental permits or on permits and licenses which say that this is a law that outrules all other legislation on the protection of forests and allows the privatization of forests. And most of the foreign logging concessions are given at the moment to 3 companies from China, Kazakhstan, and from Russia. So I would assume, even if there are good efforts really in due capacity building of park management and protection of forest, there are limitations. And I mean, there is no prescription on how to do capacity building on natural resource management. I mean, that's the core of international environmental policy, probably. But it demonstrates a little bit the limitations of state sovereignty. And President Saakashvili, he clearly stated several times in the past couple of weeks that that Georgia has its priority on economic growth for the next couple of years. So that is the reason why they would like and would need to explore the natural resource base. They don't think in very long terms.
Terrific. Well, I'll maybe take a couple of John's and Len's. Len, very briefly, I think Lynn Ostrom's stuff would be excellent to look at, and as you suggest, go back and see the obvious similarities here. I think what would be particularly useful to try to learn from her work is understanding how those efforts that were successful, how it works in terms of the challenge of those really often very local, are not necessarily scaled up, but how you get into them, and particularly then match it up to some of our institutions that want short-term project rather than process-driven, not a lot of money on the cheap, versus some of these kind of, as Alex said, longer-term investments, process as an end in itself, and participation and such. And so part of it is how to get to those programs and understanding what she and her colleagues learned in terms of getting them started, and in some ways getting our institutions to better appreciate the longer-term success of those. John, on the question of the greening security versus militarizing the environment, I think it really matters how you do it, obviously. It's a point that you raise that can have real challenges. We've run into a number of circumstances, and Alex particularly in Central Asia and the Caucasus, where folks say, yes, we're absolutely most interested in doing these programs. Please don't call it environmental peacemaking or conflict prevention, because it brings a different set of parties and different set of issues to the table. So how does one pursue the process what frame one uses, as you said, depends on who brings the table. That said, I think we can't, we try to avoid engaging in the sense that, oh, we'll just pick up 1% of U.S. military funding and put it over here and that'll solve all our problems. And you're not someone who does that. I can't say that we haven't had that suggestion here. And of course it's appealing, but it's kind of in the realm of the fantasy. So in that sense, the military is a powerful institution that we need to deal with. I think we're learning some of the lessons in those above the fold headline places, that if you don't take care of water and sanitation and basic services generally, you're not going to have long-term success with the population and building support. And so we see a kind of evolution of doctrine there, even the counterinsurgency strategy, noting this kind of hearts and minds goes to stomach and water and health issues, right? And so being a resource for integrating that into the way our military interventions go forward, I think is critically important. I think it can be a non-traditional voice for raising the priority of these issues. And in that sense can say, we don't want any part of this mission, but in part because problems arise if it's not taken care of, it needs to be taken care of by those who really know what they're doing. I think that's one of the most valuable things that the military could do. In that sense, it's an opportunity. I also think, as much as the kind of coming out of the Cold War showed us that the mill-to-mill, military-to-military cooperation among countries that have either been in conflict or coming out of conflict can actually be quite useful, and scientific and environmental areas are a safe area for that kind of dialogue, and particularly in areas where we're interested in professionalization of a military to institute norms of civilian control and such, that this can be a safe area where, again, the environmental end is certainly not the only, and may actually be a secondary to some of these other goals, that there are opportunities for us to explore. I'm afraid there were a number of other questions, but I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. I would suggest that we continue this conversation downstairs on the ground floor, where we have a reception, and as I mentioned, in a few minutes or so, we'll have some comments from Mr. Hamilton from here, from the Wilson Center, and Mr. Haindl from the German Embassy. So please, won't you join us in thanking our panelists, and join us downstairs. Oh, shoot, I didn't use my students' questions. That's too bad. Yeah, a couple questions from